Hey guys, in the previous video, I built this Frankenstein transmission to install into my E46 BMW. And in this video, we're going to install it. Let's go. Now, if you haven't seen the previous video, basically I took a GM transmission from an E46 BMW, took all the guts out of it, and replaced them with the guts from a Cadillac transmission. They came from a Cadillac with a V8. So basically now I have an automatic transmission that is significantly stronger than stock, but it's basically bolt-in with one or two caveats. But we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, my car originally came with the ZF automatic, so in addition to building the Frankenstein transmission, we're also going to be doing the ZF to GM automatic swap. That's one of the caveats. The other caveat is, okay, so like I mentioned in the previous video, I had to use the Cadillac tail housing on the transmission because of interference issues, and that's going to cause an issue with the transmission mount. Now, if we look at the BMW tail housing here, obviously the mount fits it perfectly. But on the Cadillac tail housing, you can see it's a little bit different. And yeah, so we just need to make an adapter bracket to fill in the gaps. And to make our adapter bracket, I'm just going to use a piece of steel flat stock. In case anybody's wondering, this is 1/8 inch by 2 inch mild steel flat stock. And we'll just cut out a chunk of this, drill a couple holes in it, and we'll have ourselves a bracket. Okay, so unfortunately I don't have any fancy metalworking tools, but I've got this magic vise. And actually, if I take this piece of steel and I tap it on the magic vise, it will magically transform this into a mounting bracket. What, you don't believe me? Watch this. Ready? Set? Go. Hey, check that out. I told you that vise was magic. Hey, let's check this and make sure it fits. Okay, so we got our bracket installed on the transmission. Let's see if the transmission mount fits it. Nice. Alright, I think that'll work. Now you may have noticed that these two holes in the adapter bracket are slotted, and that's to make it easier to install the mount. You see, on the OEM tail housing, or I should say the BMW tail housing, they're slotted in the other direction, presumably so the mount can slide in from the back. But I want to design mine so the mount can come up from the bottom. Oh, and in case you're concerned that the slots may reduce the contact surface area on the bracket, look at the stock piece. Look at how big those slots are. And look at how much contact that nut actually has compared to that. Need I say more? Okay, so next up is the drive shaft. I picked up this unit from the junkyard from another E46 with the GM transmission, because the GM and the ZF drive shaft are actually a different length, or at least this part up here is a different length. Now off camera I already replaced the center support bearing. I'm not going to go into detail about that because there are already good videos on it, but just a couple quick notes. First of all, since this car is a 330, the drive shaft comes apart by removing this little bolt right here. And then this piece and this piece separate. Now before you do that, you want to put marks on it like I did here, so that when you put it back together, they line up correctly. And that's important because the drive shaft is balanced as a complete unit. Actually, there's one of the balance weights right there. And if you put it back together and these are lined up differently, that can affect the balance and it might cause vibration. Oh, by the way, I mentioned there was other videos on this. There's a really good video from Shop Life TV. Actually, I used that video as a reference for this. I'll put a link in the description. Okay, moving on. Okay, so next is the transmission cooler and the lines. Now these came with the GM transmission when I bought it. They were actually still attached to the transmission. Technically, I don't think I need the cooler. I can detach the lines from it and connect them to my existing transmission cooler. However, the lines are different between the GM and the ZF automatic. So we do need the lines. Okay, so basically the cooler lines are good to go. Let's move on to the next thing. And last but not least is the transmission controller and the wiring harness. Once again, this stuff came with this transmission when I bought it, which is nice. And also the ZF and the GM automatics use a different transmission controller, and also I think some of the wiring is different. As a matter of fact, according to stuff I've read on the internet, I may end up having to splice a couple wires. But we will burn that bridge when we get to it. Let's move on. Okay, so we have our transmission, the mount bracket, torque converter, drive shaft, cooler lines, and last but not least, the electronics. As NASA would say, all systems are go. Now, of course, before we can install all that, we first need to remove the old transmission. So let's do that. Okay, folks, we got the car up in the air. I decided I'm going to drop the transmission out the bottom, so I needed to get it high enough so that I can get the transmission jack under there, drop the transmission out, and pull it out the front. We'll see how that goes. And you can see I built some wood cribbing for the front wheels. For the back, oh wow, focus. For the back, I just put it up on jack stands because I might need to have the rear wheels up off the ground so I can rotate them to rotate the drive shaft and get to all the bolts and stuff. Now, we've already been in here before. We've removed and reinstalled the exhaust multiple times and that big heat shield under the drive shaft and the drive shaft itself. So I think we're going to skip ahead through that stuff. Let's go ahead and get to the good part. Just a side note, a transmission jack is pretty handy for dropping the exhaust. Okay folks, so the exhaust is out, that big heat shield is also out, and the drive shaft is out. This is actually a good opportunity to compare the ZF and the GM drive shafts. Now the one on the bottom is the ZF unit that just came out of the car. Actually the back half of the drive shaft is the same, but the front half is different. If you'll notice, the ZF drive shaft is a little bit longer, and that's because the ZF transmission is physically shorter than the GM transmission. So the drive shaft has to make up the difference. So now you can see why we need to swap out the drive shaft. Okay, and here's what the underside of the car looks like with all the stuff removed. Well, everything but the transmission. And wow, we got some leakage. I'm not sure if that's transmission oil or engine oil, but it doesn't smell like transmission oil. It might be engine oil. So it's probably the rear main seal, which I was already planning to replace it anyway. I bought a new one. So, no big deal. Okay, so before we remove the transmission from the car, we first need to detach the torque converter from the engine. And to do that, we need to remove this little rubber plug right next to the exhaust. And if we look through that little inspection hole, that will give us access to the torque converter bolts. Yeah, actually there's one of the bolts right there. Okay, so removing those torque converter bolts was pretty tedious. as you can see, we had to put a nice long extension on the socket wrench to get around the exhaust. Also, we had to put a wrench on the crankshaft pulley bolt so we could turn the engine to the right position, and also so we can keep the engine from turning while we're undoing these bolts. Fun stuff. But now that the torque converter is disconnected from the engine, now we can start unbolting the transmission. Okay, so I think I may have gotten a little bit ahead of myself. Before we can think about unbolting the transmission, of course we've got some other stuff we need to disconnect also. So, for example, I disconnected the shifter cable, moved that out of the way. Then I disconnected the electrical connector and I moved that out of the way so I can get access to the transmission cooler lines right here. We'll pop these loose, we'll let that drain out for a little bit, and then we will take out the transmission. Okay, drippy drip drip. By the way, I also drained out the transmission oil into here. I also disconnected the battery. Okay, so the maintenance manual says to remove the cabin filter housing so we can tilt the engine back and get better access to some of those mounting bolts. Now, if I was smart, I probably would have done that before I jacked up the car 2 feet in the air. Oh well. Okay, so now we can see the starter. It is right there. And I thought I'd be smart and reach in here and get at the starter bolts from the top. But unfortunately, there just isn't enough room to get that ratchet in there. That's one of the starter bolts right there. And just not enough room. So we're going to have to do the thing they talk about in the maintenance manual where we tilt the engine backwards and get it from, no, I'm not going to say it, reach in from where we access the bolts from the rear.
Yeah, me.
Okay, since we have this other transmission here, I can conveniently show you where all the mounting bolts are. Or at least all the bolts that attach the transmission to the engine. We'll start with these 3 small ones on the bottom. I actually got these already, but they take an inverted Torx E10 socket, and these guys come in from the back. Then there are 4 of these big bolts. They look like this. These guys take an E14 socket. There's one here, one here, one here, and one there. These are the 2 starter bolts. They take an E12 socket, and once again, all these bolts are coming in from the back. And last but not least, we have this little guy, which, as you can see, goes in this way, and it uses a regular 10mm socket. Now I've already removed these 3 small ones, and I've removed that big one, and of course you just saw I removed this little guy. So we still need to get these 2, and these 2, and that guy. Okay folks, we got a transmission jack under the transmission. We're going to detach the cross member from the car and carefully let the transmission down to angle the engine and transmission so we can get access to those mounting bolts. Also, the maintenance manual says that you need to remove the cross brace here, and after looking at it, I think they're right. the bolts are out. It's just hanging out there. Time to lower this thing down and remove the rest of those bolts. Wow, these starter bolts are something else. I needed about 3 feet of extensions to reach in there. Oh, and sorry for the noise, that's my fan because, you know, Florida, summer. Yeah, fun times. Wow, this one last bolt up above the exhaust was a huge pain in the butt. It's actually difficult to get the camera in there, but yeah, I actually had to go to the store and buy some more 1/2-inch socket extensions because the 3/8 ones weren't strong enough. It felt like they were gonna break. So yeah, fun times. And here's another shot of it from another angle, looking in through the from behind the transmission. So I'm wondering what it's going to be like to get the other transmission in. Okay, so I drained out the oil from the ZF transmission when I removed it, or actually before I removed it. I poured most of the oil into a container for recycling, and this is the stuff that was left in the bottom of the pan. Now, some of this junk here actually fell into the pan afterwards, but if we look here, we got sparkles, little bits of metal all over the place. So yeah, this transmission was living on borrowed time. No, I don't feel bad about replacing it. Well, I didn't feel bad about it to begin with, but you get the idea. Okay folks, the ZF automatic is out. And wow, look at all the schmoo inside the bell housing. I wonder how much of that is transmission oil and how much is engine oil. Actually, let's go take a look at the rear main seal on the engine. Alrighty, here's the rear main seal on the engine, and guess what folks? We got wetness, and not the good kind. But we got a new rear main seal ready to go, so we'll just install this guy before we put the new transmission in. Okay, the transmission cooler lines are out, and boy was that fun. I'm being sarcastic, of course. But the lines snake through here and through there and up above the steering rack and stuff. Basically, I had to twist them and turn them and finagle them this way and that way to slowly get them worked out through this opening here, and they came out that way. Here they are. Oh, also, I should probably mention that since I have an aftermarket transmission cooler up here, I've got these extra lines here. And that means when I install the new cooler lines, I'm going to have to cut one of them to splice it into here. Just FYI. Man, this transmission is super crusty. Check that out. And actually the transmission tunnel inside the car is just as bad. So I think before I install this guy, I'm going to power wash the underside of the car. And this, my friends, is what you call mission creep. Oh, and what's up with all the airplanes today? Holy crap, there's an airplane going over like every 2 minutes. Okay, time to deal with this mess. Now, some of this stuff I removed with a putty knife because it was caked on pretty thick. Actually, I think some of this actually was undercoating, but it was getting dirt and grime basically embedded in it, and I didn't like that. Besides, we're in Florida. You don't need undercoating. Cars don't rust here unless you go to the beach a lot, and I don't. So there we go. Okay, anyway, to deal with the rest of this stuff, we're going to use Super Clean in the aerosol can this time. Alright, now it's clean. Or at least it's cleaner. By the way, when I removed the Flexplate from the engine, I took a Sharpie marker and I put some locating marks on the Flexplate and on the crankshaft. Now, I'm not exactly sure if this only has to go on one way, but I figured it wouldn't hurt, just to be safe. Okay, here are the two transmission mount brackets. This is the one for the GM transmission, and this is the one from the ZF that I just pulled out of the car. I could be wrong, but the brackets look almost identical. Of course, this one has the stock rubber mounts, and this one has Driveshaft polyurethane mounts, which I installed a while back. But aside from that, these appear to be almost identical. And yeah, I'm going to put the polyurethane mounts on the GM bracket. Okay, so here we have the Driveshaft urethane mounts on the GM crossover. Now, so far, these Driveshaft mounts have been working just fine for me. However, I would like to point something out, and that is the top mounting nuts are different from stock. Here's one of the stock ones, and you can see they're slightly different size. Now, to be fair, these have been working for me so far. However, here comes an airplane. However, the engine is going to be making more power pretty soon, and I would rather not risk it. So, I'm going to reuse the stock ones. Sorry, Driveshaft, but your nuts are too small. Okay, now that we got this out of the way, let's move on. Also, I'm going to take this opportunity to clean the heat shields and the motor plate. Okay, this piece was fun to clean. By the way, this is the cover plate that goes underneath the fuel pressure regulator. Anyway, originally I thought this had a textured coating on it, but the coating was actually a bunch of road grime with dirt embedded in it. And it was so thick it looked like undercoating. But I was able to loosen it up with a putty knife and a wire brush, and then I finished off with some Super Clean. And now it looks nice. By the way, if you hear any rain or thunder in the background, that's because Hurricane Helene is passing nearby, and it will be affecting our weather for the next couple days. Okay, since we're doing the ZF to GM transmission swap, that also means that we need to swap out the transmission controller. This blue piece right here is the transmission controller. This guy has to come out. Before we pull it out, we're going to undo the electrical connectors and move the wiring out of the way. It's got two of these connectors. I'm not sure what the official name is, but I call them rock to lock. You got a little tab right here that you got to push down, and then you just rotate this over, and it comes right out. And last but not least, we have this one connector, which I've already loosened up because it's kind of a pain. But it's got this one tab right here that you squeeze in, and then you pull it straight out. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the transmission controller. Okay, so once again, this part of the transmission wiring harness is going to be replaced with the new one. Unfortunately, this is not a separate cable. It gets incorporated into this big wiring bundle right here. That wiring bundle goes behind the brake booster, and it comes out down here. It's this guy right here. Actually, if we look down here, we can see the two cables going down to the transmission. Those guys are going bye-bye. But there is some other wiring right here that you don't want to damage, because this actually goes to the upstream O2 sensors, so that's kind of important. Okay, so here's a better look at that wiring bundle. I pulled it out of its little hidey spot back there. And once again, this is the wiring for your O2 sensors. You want to make sure not to damage that. These guys are for the old transmission. This stuff is going bye-bye. Now, I pulled on this over here to see if there was any more tape inside here holding everything together, and I think there's not. This thing actually moves back and forth like so. So I'm thinking I'm just going to take these guys and cut them right here and pull them out. And that'll save me from having to slice this whole thing open. I'd rather avoid that. And in case anybody wants to comment, that ZF transmission is going in the scrap heap, and so is this wiring, so there's no need to preserve it. Okay folks, that worked perfectly. I snipped the wires and pulled them through. Hey, come back here. I snipped the wires and pulled them through just like I mentioned a second ago, and it worked great. Here is our wiring connector with our O2 sensors still completely intact. Now, when we run the new transmission wiring, we will just run that alongside this one. Oh, and by the way, I also retaped this wiring here, because anything less would be uncivilized. And we will just tuck this back behind the brake booster where it belongs. There we go. Oh, by the way, if you're wondering what these things are, this is for my aftermarket oil pressure gauge, and this is for the vacuum boost gauge. Okay, so at this point, all the old stuff is out. The transmission, obviously, the mount, drive shaft, the controller and the wiring harness, and of course the cooler lines. And we've got all this fresh new stuff ready to install. But there's a problem, actually two problems. First of all, like I mentioned earlier, the project has suffered mission creep, and that caused some delays. Although they're good delays, because it means the project is actually going to be better. The other thing is, we have Hurricane Helene coming by tomorrow. Now, it's not going to be a direct hit, but it's going to come pretty close, and it's probably going to cause delays. So unfortunately, we won't be able to do the whole swap in one video. We're going to split it into two videos. The next video, we're going to install all this stuff, we're going to get it running, and we're going to take the car for a test drive. So, stay tuned.